All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another audience submission review. We're going to get into it in just a moment. We got 4 pieces again, or 4 authors. As always, we're going to start with this little disclaimer. Keep in mind, I am not a professional reviewer. I'm just some guy on the internet who likes reading and writing. The opinions expressed in this video are only opinions. My interpretation of or reaction to the work will not be the same as everyone else's, for better or for worse. I will look for the good and the bad, but no matter what I say, don't be too hard on yourself. Just keep writing, and for those in the comments, please be respectful. Also, I'm so sorry for any mistakes or mispronunciations of names or words. If I come across a word that I don't want to say for whatever reason, I will replace it with the word blank. Alright, so with that, we're going to go ahead and get into it, and speaking of potential mispronunciations, I am already sorry in advance. I'll say Hawsk. Hawsk is one of my patrons, and so I really want to thank them for their support. And I think I mentioned in the last video, when a patron submits poetry, I'll do like a maximum of 9 poems. Hawsk sent me their entire bibliography, you might say. And they just told me to pick however I would, and I ended up just kind of picking randomly. So we have 9 random poems here, some shorter, some a little bit longer, but just based on a brief look, it looks like there's a good mix here. So these are poems by Hawsk. They've also listed their author name as, I'm going to assume this is also pronounced Hawsk, I'm not entirely sure though, Hawsk Tksvi. I'm sorry, I don't know, I'm so sorry, but they're on All Poetry if you want to find more of their work. But with that, let's just go ahead and jump into the poems. So, this first one is called Staged Presence, which immediately I'll say that's a pretty good title. You know, it's a play on stage presence. There's an author's note at the bottom, but we'll just read that a little bit later. So, the poem reads, "Who pressed play on your heart today? Did they stand up and leave the crowd? Did they claim that your act's too lame, and that they hate that you're too loud? Is this at all your best of bets? Is this everything you'd hoped for? 'Cause your friends are less than impressed, and fiends are breathing on your door. You realize something horrible, not here 'cause you're adorable. Your heart's a cherry cordial, an incorporeal morsel." Oh, some pretty good rhymes at the end there. That's neat. First impression, kind of sounds like song lyrics, and like, I mean that in a good way, just because, you know, it has a good rhythm to it. It sounds like the lines would fit perfectly over music, if you ask me. Let's read the author's note here. It says, "Based on one of my dreams last night that held hope as well as pain." Okay, interesting. I wonder if we're supposed to take that author note as part of the poem. I don't think so, but kind of interesting. So we'll just take it little by little. One thing to note as well with sort of the song-ish quality to this poem, we have these internal rhymes alternating with lines that rhyme in a BB rhyme scheme, right? We have like A, B, C, B, right? So, "Who pressed play on your heart today?" That's, of course, an internal rhyme. And then on the next line we have, "Did they stand up and leave the crowd?" And then next line has another internal rhyme. "Did they claim that your act's too lame?" And last line of this 4 pattern is, "and that they hate that you're too loud," right? So A, B, C, B, and then internal rhymes on the A and the C. So that's cool. That's a unique rhyme scheme to be working with, and I think it works, to be honest. I think, you know, the more unique you can get, the better in general. Obviously not a hard and fast rule, but the more unique you can get, the better. And also working with these chosen conventions, that, you know, presents a challenge for you as an author, and that usually produces better work as well. So as far as meaning, "Who pressed play on your heart today? Did they stand up and leave the crowd? Did they claim that your act's too lame, and that they hate that you're too loud?" So sounds like, you know, we have a performer here who's being heckled, and that ties in with the title, Staged Presence, which is interesting. The next lines, "Is this at all your best of bets?" So that internal rhyme's kind of interesting. Best and bets, sort of a slant rhyme, and they're almost spelled the same, right, which is neat. And the rhythm is slightly different than the last internal rhymes that we saw, which is also kind of cool. Is this everything you'd hoped for? Because your friends are less than impressed. So that's similar to the last internal rhyme where they're kind of close together and kind of slanted. And fiends are breathing on your door. So once again, it seems like we have this visual of somebody on stage being heckled, right? And not just being heckled, but like worse than that, where even this performer's friends are quote unquote less than impressed, right? So sounds nightmarish, if you ask me. Last 4 lines read, you realize something horrible, not here 'cause you're adorable. Your heart's a cherry cordial, an incorporeal morsel. So that kind of lends to the author's note, I think, where you kind of realize, oh, this is just a bad dream, right? I'm incorporeal, as in this is not my real body, right? But interesting to think that that's something horrible, right? That kind of creates an interesting layer where it's like, if it were me in this situation, I would hope it was a dream, right? I wouldn't want this to actually be happening in real life. I would hope I was dreaming, right? And so why is that horrible? Why is it horrible for me to be adorable? Why is it horrible that my heart's a cherry cordial? That sounds kind of nice, right? So yeah, something to unpack there. I'm not totally sure on the meaning there, if I'm being honest, but yeah, that's a neat poem. Like I said, the rhymes definitely jump out, and it does have this sort of songish quality, which I actually like. So a lot of cool creative leaps taken here. Like I said, the ending definitely gives something to chew on. I wonder if it's like internally consistent, and maybe I'm just not reading into it correctly, but yeah, those are my thoughts there. Moving on to the next poem, a shorter one called Dawn Amble. Sorry, give me just a sec. I'm going to position my camera slightly. Okay. Hopefully that'll help us avoid some of the shakiness in the long run. But anyway, Dawn Amble. An undead, unleaded sunset outsets, a surprised mind untied by frightful sight. A buzzard flusters and bucks its cupboard, a coinless corpse's cordless torn organs. Interesting. So again, obviously, what jumps out is the rhyme. I'm curious, as we take a closer look at it, how that rhyme will lend to the meaning on the whole. So based on some of the language here, it kind of sounds like this poem is describing like roadkill or a dead animal, right? Although it says an undead, unleaded sunset outsets. So kind of sounds like a desert scene, right? But maybe that's just sort of my bias playing in with my initial reading of the poem, but let's keep going. A surprised mind, untied by frightful sight. So we have, I assume, the speaker, or perhaps the subject. Somebody is looking upon a frightful sight, and it surprised them, it untied their mind. Good language there, by the way. Like, not only does that fit with the rhyme, but I like the figure of speech of a mind being untied by a frightful sight. That's fun. A buzzard flusters and bucks its cupboard. Now, unless cupboard has a meaning, okay, thinking about it a little bit further, it sounds like, again, we have a buzzard, like a vulture, eating something that's dead, right? That's what vultures do, is they eat what's already dead. And so when it says that it bucks its cupboard, I assume it means whatever it's eating, right? Because we as humans keep what we're eating in our cupboards. So if that's the case, that's pretty fun. That's a nice use of synecdoche, I think, where cupboard is referring to just the buzzard's food, right? And last, a coinless corpse's cordless torn organs. Yeah, so I think my initial interpretation is correct, where it just sounds like it's somebody in the desert seeing a dead thing being eaten by a buzzard, rather graphically, right? I guess my main response here after coming to that conclusion is just sort of like, so what, right? My question would be, what's the effect that this visual has on the subject besides just this feeling of fright, right? What does this poem have to say beyond what it's saying literally, right? That would be my main response to the poem. And so to that question, I think you could add more lines here, not just because the lines that are already written are great, but because I think there's just more to unpack here, right? I think we all have a response to seeing a dead animal, right? It's sort of that abject horror of confronting death in the first place and realizing that nature can be unforgiving, that sort of thing, right? And I mean, the author doesn't have to take it down that road. But what's the deeper impact here on the person who's seeing this sight unfolding? I think digging into that question would really elevate the poem all the more. And it's already really great. The fact that I think it's too short shows that, I want more of it. I think it could be even better, right? And so I'll leave it on that thought, and we'll move on to this third one, another short one. Events of our romance. I assume that's pronounced events. I gotta be honest, I'm not entirely sure. But the poem reads, a nest in farmer's field, fortressed pheasants, a fresh blade to flesh, effortless bloodlet, a butcher satisfied with his knife, a gift of meat and cheese for the hungry. Okay, so first impressions again. It sounds like, okay, well, I guess my first impression was the alliteration, which I like. It doesn't feel too heavy-handed. A lot of times alliteration can feel both amateurish and just like way too much, but here it doesn't feel forced, if I'm being honest, and maybe that just comes down to a lot of personal opinion, but that's just how I feel. I think it reads well personally. My other first impression here was it sounds like a farmer who's beheading a chicken so that they can prepare the chicken to be eaten, right? And I guess it doesn't have to be a chicken specifically. It does say pheasant, right? It could be a literal pheasant. It could be any bird for that matter. We don't know for sure. And again, I guess my main question with the poem is simply the same as the last one, is what's the effect on the speaker in this case? Because I assume it's the speaker who's recounting this. I assume they saw it firsthand. And so what's the effect that it had on them? These two poems that we just read back to back, they work pretty well as a pair, honestly. I might even sort of combine these because they are about something similar, right? Seeing the death of an animal, or seeing, what one individual group will do with a dead animal. I might combine these into one poem and then also add a third stanza with 4 more lines, sort of talking about, what is the overarching takeaway from these events. Yeah. But as written, both very good, for real. All right, we got a little bit of a longer piece here. This one is called Big Man Jack Porter, which I feel like is a reference to something, but I could be wrong. Let's see. I think the poem starts here with the word Saturday, so we're going to read it as such, but we'll find out, I guess, if I'm wrong. So, Saturday, 19XX, 3:18 p.m. He'd laid on a slab in the coroner's cold lab, 'cause earlier today he died. He'd gone for a snack, but all he'd found was a trap. Poor guy was surprised and robbed blind. Saturday, 19XX, 5:52 a.m. Big man Jack Porter backed me into a corner and demanded a slice of pie. Although I'm shorter, it's not too tall in order for thumbs to plumb depths of his eyes. Saturday, 19XX, 3:19 p.m. The woman in black, with her wrapped hands in her lap, says, "This is no brother of mine." Saturday, 19XX, 5:51 a.m. Big man Jack snickered, 'cause he's followed his sister, past the train tracks and just behind. Jack is a grifter, an unparalleled trickster, but not up to snuff for a fight. Sunday, 19XX, 8:13 p.m. Oh, hang on. I may have cut this one off. I hope that's not the case. It looked like this was where it ended when I had printed it, but maybe not. Shoot, I'm sorry if I did cut this one off. But let's take it as is. So again, first impressions, want to highlight the rhythm. I think this is a play on Jack Horner, right? I don't know that rhyme by heart, but I'm pretty sure this is kind of how the rhythm is, like Little Miss Muffet, right? Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, eating her curds and whey. He laid on a slab in the coroner's cold lab, 'cause earlier today he died, right? It's got that nursery rhyme quality to it. For a reader, it is a little bit confusing moving back and forth between these two time periods, especially because with one, we're actually moving back in time. Like, this one goes from 552 to 551. So it's a little bit hard keeping track of the events as written, at least for me. That might not be the case for every reader, but it's just a lot of change happening pretty quickly, right? That said, though, it started out really interesting before it, was a little bit harder to follow, where Saturday the 19th in the afternoon, we have this dead person, and then we go back to see how this person died, we presume. So let's take a look here. Saturday 19XX 5:52 a.m. Big man Jack Porter backed me into a corner and demanded a slice of pie. Although I'm shorter, it's not too tall in order for thumbs to plumb depths of his eyes. Okay, I see what's happening here. So it sounds like Jack is the one who is the dead man, right? This person who is smaller than Jack and was apparently ambushed by Jack, he plunged his thumbs into Jack's eyes, it sounds like. And rather than plunge, it's plumb, because, again, that's another indication this is sort of about Jack Horner, which is fun. That's fun wordplay. The whole thing has a lot of fun wordplay and a lot of, allusions to little Jack Horner, which this is unimportant, but, I can't think of Jack Horner without thinking of the Puss in Boots movie, which is phenomenal. Anyway, back to the poem. The woman in black with her wrapped hands in her lap says, "This is no brother of mine." So it sounds as though this is somebody who knew the deceased, mourning them, and perhaps there's a lot of depth to that line, "This is no brother of mine." For one thing, that could suggest that the body was unrecognizable, and the woman is so taken aback by that fact that they would prefer not to recognize them, right? Or it just speaks to the deceased's character, where this mourner doesn't want to have any affiliation to them. I think the first interpretation is maybe more likely, since why would the woman be in black if they didn't want to mourn this person, right? But I like that. There's a lot to unpack there. And then Big Man Jack snickered. This is back in the past again, because he'd followed his sister past the train tracks and just behind. Jack is a grifter, an unparalleled trickster, but not up to snuff for a fight. Okay, so it sounds like this woman then is Jack's literal sister. So, again, I apologize. I'm not sure if this is where the poem actually ends. If it's not, I am sorry. But it sounds perhaps like the sister was with the person who killed Jack, right? And that's why Jack followed them, we suppose, perhaps. So I will say this, there's a mystery element here, which is cool. It does require a pretty close reading to keep up with all the moving parts here, which is fine because, that's what some audience members like. Certainly what I like, right? I enjoyed this poem the more I read it, which is awesome. That's a sign of a good poem, right? Because with a lot of insta poetry, for example, when you reread it, there's nothing more that you gain from it. And that's just disappointing, right? Because poetry is supposed to have a lot of depth in theory, and it's fun to be able to discover something new each time you read it. And so it's cool that this poem has that quality. And then, again, one more time, I apologize if this wasn't where it was supposed to end. It does kind of seem like this is a non-ending, right? And yet, it kind of could just end on this line, and there would still be a lot to unpack, right? So there's a lot going on here, and that's awesome. Let's move on to the next one. This one is called What's It Take to Wake You? So just based on the title, sounds like we might have some more internal rhymes here. At the very least, there's one in the title. So the poem reads, Once upon a midnight splendid, as a demon of dreams, beside his grave I spied the storms that strode past the horizon. Cracks of black lightning descended, cast out by ashen steeds, bore sore cords of brass horns, crossed swords, and fiends aboard that ride them. My finger's grip bites through his flesh, soon I'll see his hand's skill, hear his melody delicate, but will he know when to rise? A sigh of spice pervades his breath, downy locks chalked with dill. Failed is my try to vellicate, this arrives as no surprise. Okay. So once again, I have to notice the rhyme because it's creative. It's a little atypical, right? It looks as though we're working with A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, and then E, F, G, H, E, F, G, H. Splendid, and then on the next stanza, descended. Dreams, next stanza, steeds. Spied the storms, crossed swords, so storm, swords, slant rhyme. And then horizon, ride them, again, another slant rhyme. But that's cool. It's harder to pick up on than some of the other rhymes we've seen so far, but that's okay. For me, it still came across. I don't know if it'll be the case for everybody, but I like it. So as for what's literally happening in the poem, that might take a little more analysis. Another thing to point out is Once Upon a Midnight Splendid. That is a pretty clear allusion to The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, which begins Once Upon a Midnight Dreary. So it was a little jarring to read that line and then have the next lines not follow the same rhythmic pattern that The Raven follows. But I mean, it's okay. It's obviously okay to deviate, and, you know, that subversion was probably, I assume, part of the point. But anyway, let's get into what is actually happening in this poem. So, Once upon a midnight splendid, as a demon of dreams, beside his grave I spied the storms that strode past the horizon. So it sounds like this person is an infiltrator in someone's dreams, and his, I assume, is the person who's dreaming, and this person who's dreaming is imagining their grave with storms on the horizon. Cracks of black lightning descended, cast out by ashen steeds, bore sore cords of brass horns, crossed swords. That line reads well, that's cool. And fiends aboard that ride them. I am noticing some similar language to one of the previous poems that we read. The first one, I think, which is fine. You know, I think most poets do that a lot. I saw that when I was reading Pablo Neruda, where he clearly has some favorite words that he relies upon a lot. So it's fine, you know, authors are going to be consistent with themselves. But anyway, so we get more language describing the storm. Ashen steeds is a pretty cool metaphor. I assume that that's describing the dark clouds as if they were horses. And it kind of describes, I think, this storm as like a battle in the sky, which is fascinating. Very cool descriptors going on here. My finger's grip bites through his flesh. Soon I'll see his hand's skill, hear his melody delicate, but will he know when to rise? So it almost sounds like the speaker is digging through the grave of the subject, hoping to fight them. That's what it sounds like. which is another interesting visual and an interesting turn of the narrative. And maybe one might suppose that's why the storm is happening, is because this grave is being defiled, and that's, an affront against nature, maybe, against God. I don't know. A sigh of spice pervades his breath. Interesting. Downy locks chalked with dill. Failed is my try to vellicate. This arrives as no surprise. I'll be honest, I don't know what the word vellicate means. I'll have to look that one up later. But it sounds like what I described, where the person wants to bring this subject back to life, but they fail to do so. And as disappointing as that is, they're not surprised with this outcome. So there's actually a lot operating in this poem. These longer poems all have pretty decent depth to them, which is great. I love a poem with depth. I think there are a lot of different ways you could interpret this. You could interpret it as grief, right? Somebody trying to come to terms with the loss of maybe a rival or even, a very close friend. You could interpret this as simply the way of the earth, like unto dust we come and unto dust we will return, or however that goes. You could interpret this as the speaker themselves confronting the fact that they will one day have to die. So there really is a lot going on here, and that's awesome. I don't really have any notes beyond that. There's just a lot that you can dissect here, which is cool. Moving on. This one's called Non-Consenting Co-op Pain Simulator. Forever and always forever is such a great long time with you. Our strengths and our weaknesses hold the keys to what the secret is. Not quite sure why it's so secretive, but for now, that's how we'll have to live. Forever and always is such a great long time. It's true that always forever I'll choose to be with you. That's right, I've been watching you all night with my astral eyes, and I realize by eagle sight our love is, as prophesized, forever and always can always be forever in a non-consenting co-op pain simulator. Okay, so on the surface it sounds very romantic, right? But it, based on the title and based on the last line, it seems that there's a fair dose of irony going on. Sorry, I dropped my pen, so I was picking it up just now. I mean, we'll take it line by line, but I'm not sure if there's really anything to say beyond that. Well, I'm sure there will be, because that's how poems are. So, forever and always forever is such a great long time with you. Okay, so I guess one note that I'll throw in right off the bat is we know, having read this poem once, that these lines are going to repeat themselves. But as much as I don't love repetition personally, I think it actually works here because it seems that each time it's repeated, it takes on a bit of a new meaning. So let's keep our eyes peeled for that as we keep going. Our strengths and our weaknesses hold the keys to what the secret is. Not quite sure why it's so secretive, but for now, that's how we'll have to live. So another thing to note, all pretty good rhymes. Weaknesses, secret is, secretive, have to live. Slant rhymes for the most part, but pretty cool, honestly. I like the way that those sound all together. I like it. I will say, so again, on its surface as sort of a romantic poem, it seems to be ruminating on the strengths and weaknesses of each individual and them as a couple. But then there's this idea that something is secret, but I don't know what. It's a little vague, and I'm not sure if that vagueness is to the poem's benefit or not, if you ask me. But regardless, moving on. Forever and always is such a great long time, it's true, that always forever I'll choose to be with you. So again, that sounds pretty romantic on its face, but let's keep going. That's right, I've been watching you. So that kind of sounds like a shift, right? Where I don't think that would be a pleasant thing for anyone to hear, regardless of who it's coming from, to find out that you've been observed without your knowing it. Sounds awful. All night. So again, that sounds even worse, right? It sounds like someone has watched you as you sleep. Sounds terrible. With my astral eyes, and I realize by eagle sight our love is as prophesized. So again, you kind of have to imagine somebody saying this to you point blank. It sounds kind of terrifying, right? And so with that in mind, the last stanza, when it says, forever and always can always be forever in a non-consenting co-op pain simulator. So that sort of adds to the ironic subversion of the poem, where the language up to this point has been pretty simple and a little bit flowery, a little bit romantic, right? Whereas the phrase non-consenting co-op pain simulator, that's not so flowery, right? It's kind of weird, right? It's supposed to sound weird. It's supposed to sound different from the rest of the poem. It adds to the subversion there. So I like what it's got going on. You kind of pick up on what it's saying on the first reading, which is fine. It's fine for poems to be direct. And, it sounds like it's a commentary on, I'm sure, what a lot of women experience, especially where they are observed by men when they don't want to be, right? And, a lot of men will have that problem too, where they receive unwanted attention, whether it's from men or women. And the same goes for women, right? They can receive unwanted attention from any gender. I just think that experience in the patriarchy that we live in is a little bit more a woman's experience. It can happen to men, but they, probably don't receive it quite as much. So that's sort of my interpretation of what's going on here. But anyhow, let's move on to the next one. Hang on, let me just double check how many we've done so far. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 3 more. Make sure I haven't missed one. Nope, I don't think so. Okay, this one is called Church of the Fly. Before we get into the poem, I gotta say that that's a really cool title. Of the titles we've seen so far, that one is probably the one that would intrigue me the most. As a poem, it sort of reminds me of Emily Dickinson's poem, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, which also has religious themes, and so the title Church of the Fly almost sounds like, it makes me wonder, is this going to be in connection with that poem? And even if it's not, right, even divorced from that poem by Dickinson, it's still just a rather eye-catching title. So anyhow, Church of the Fly. For every moment that I live, that is a second in which I die. This is the mantra we all give when we pray at the Church of the Fly. I was an initiate then. I was so young and I was so dumb. They said I was special within. I should have known. I should have run. Now I'm the right hand of the church. Our resplendent priest picked me herself. She said we shall now end our search. Invite to tonight on my shelf. Now with salmon eyes I stare up high, still beating heart silhouettes the sky. Sounds like we have a sonnet here. Let me verify that. For every moment that I live, that is a second in which I die. So not quite a sonnet in terms of rhythm, just based on the first 2 lines. I won't scan the whole thing, but the rhyme scheme is that of a Shakespearean sonnet, right? We have A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. So, yeah, I like that. I'm a sucker for sonnets. I think I've said that on the main channel before. And, it's fine that it doesn't follow the traditional rhythm too. I assume that that's purposeful. If that makes a better poem, then great, go for it, bend the rules, right? But anyway, let's get to the substance or the goings on of the work. For every moment that I live, that is a second in which I die. So right off the bat, I think that's a pretty good opener. It gives the audience something to consider. And it kind of rings true in the sense that, as time passes, we're not the same person we used to be. Is that true for every single second? Maybe not, but maybe in a metaphysical sense, kind of, because, yeah, we're not quite exactly the same person that we were 1 second ago, based on, like, our molecular makeup, the way our blood is pumping, right, etc. So there's a lot to consider with just those 2 lines, and that makes it a really great opener. And yet, just based on the title, the image of Church of the Fly, we kind of assume there's something sinister with that idea of a mantra, right? This is the mantra we all give when we pray at the Church of the Fly. I was an initiate then. I was so young, and I was so dumb. They said I was special within. I should have known. I should have run. So again, that gives an even more explicit indication that something sinister is going on here if the speaker feels that they should have run. And yet, next stanza says, now I'm the right hand of the church. Our resplendent priest picked me herself. So a couple of things there. So in one instance, the speaker is saying they should have run. But in the next, they call the priest resplendent, which sounds like a great thing, right? Sounds like a very praising descriptor. Another thing to note is that the priest is a woman herself, uses she, her pronouns, and yet the title should be priestess, right? So there is perhaps something to be said there. She said, we shall now end our search, invite to tonight on my shelf. So a little internal rhyme there with invite to tonight. But again, there's just that sense of something is weird and wrong here with this idea of we shall now end our search. Like, what does that mean? Why does the search end? And what's going to happen now that the search is over? So I like this feeling of dread that kind of permeates throughout the poem. Is this line right here, I should have known, I should have run, is that line a little bit explicit, maybe a little bit heavy-handed? Perhaps, yeah, and perhaps it could be revised to be slightly more subtle, because I think the sense of dread comes through even without having to say this so explicitly, but that's just one thing to consider. The ending couplet says, now with salmon eyes I stare up high, still beating heart silhouettes the sky. So salmon eyes kind of sounds like a literal fly, because flies, I think, have red eyes, don't they, right? And then, as for that very last line, still beating heart silhouettes the sky. The verb silhouettes is kind of interesting. Is that to say, like, it eclipses the sky? Is that to say it's in the image of the sky? Is it stuck in the sky? So, interesting word choice there. Again, just based on the penultimate line, with salmon eyes, it sounds as though the speaker has been turned into a fly, right? Which, spooky. Dreadful, right? What a terrible experience. Who would want that for themselves? And one thing to point out here that I didn't show is that the author note says this is inspired by cults. And yeah, that comes through. I think personally that comes through even without the author having to say it right here. It's again that idea of like explicitness. I think one can interpret that this is about like indoctrination without having the author say it explicitly. But yeah, anyhow, I like this one. There's a lot to unpack there once again. This next one is called The Long Lost. Excuse me. I go to see a long-lost kin. She asks me if I'd like to sin. I nod my head. She laid me in bed. She whips me over and sticks it in. Jeez. Oof. Yeah. I mean, you know, there's there's obviously a sexual overtone there, which is not hard to read. And the fact that it's, you know, family members doing this adds to the layer of, you know, it adds to the oomph of the whole thing, just sort of the initial innate natural response to be repulsed here, right? It relies a lot on shock, right? That, you know, a lot of good poems sort of end with a clincher, right? A last line that really kind of sticks with you and maybe even makes you rethink the entire premise of the poem in the first place. This one just kind of makes you go, ugh. And again, I'm not sure if that's really to the poem's benefit, to be honest. And again, kind of with some of the other shorter poems we looked at, after reading this one, I'm sort of left to just ask, like, so what, right? What's the broader understanding I'm supposed to take away from this poem? It's kind of hard to find a deeper meaning here, in part because of the length, but also there's just not a lot to dissect here, besides, what's literally happening. I feel like maybe if some words were added or changed to maybe point the reader in a particular direction, that would be helpful. As it stands, it's just a little too vague and a little too shocking to really extract takeaways from. So let's see. This will be the last one, it looks like. Now that's what I call a cure-all. Hang on. What's with the camera focus? There we go. That's a little better. Today, I felt real sick. My beau offered some dick. I grit my teeth and let him sheathe. I think that did the trick. Okay, so on the one hand, you can kind of just interpret this as a bit of a joke. And I think the poem adds to that. Now that's what I call a cure-all. It's just kind of funny, right? Like, suggesting that dick is a cure-all. It's funny. I'm sorry. I'm a child at heart, and I giggle. On the other hand, there is perhaps a more sinister way to interpret this poem, especially with the third line where it says, I grit my teeth. It kind of sounds like the speaker is bearing themselves for something unpleasant, right? And, maybe it ended up being pleasant in the end, but maybe the speaker is putting on a facade, right? I think there are some questions to be had here. So before we got into the works, I'm sorry that I couldn't give any content warnings. The author mentioned that there are triggers, as perhaps we saw, but they did not specify which triggers. As I also mentioned, the author sort of sent all the poems that they have ever written, well, maybe not all of them, but a large volume of poems, and so they probably didn't know, which triggers to include, because there were potentially a lot of them. So I apologize if anyone was caught off guard in a triggering way. I really, really am sorry about that. But besides that, as for thoughts on the poems themselves, these were good. There was a lot of range here, which was cool. Like I said, I think the longer ones sort of accomplished more of what they set out to, both in the use of language and in just communicating a meaning, a message, something for the audience to uncover. The shorter ones still did use language in pretty impactful ways, pretty fun ways too. A lot of great rhymes and a lot of fun uses of just rhythm and alliteration and rhyme. Yeah. We kind of went back in time. It looks like I'm noticing the dates here. It looks like we started in 2023 and then went back to 2018, which actually kind of checks out, if you ask me. I think we kind of see the growth and what's the word I'm looking for? I think we see that the more recent poems are a little bit more polished than some of those earlier ones. Not exclusively, not entirely, but yeah. So, once again, Hawsk, I want to thank you for this submission, and I super want to thank you for your support. And if anyone wants to read more poetry, you can find them on All Poetry at Hawsk. And with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next submission. So this next piece is actually fan fiction by an author who goes by CupOCoffee or just Coffee. And they do have a Wattpad. Sorry, the focus is being wonky again. There we go. So they're on wattpad.com/user/Arizona teen. The thing that they were writing a fan fiction of, I had never heard of it, and I neglected to write it down. Sorry. There may also be triggers in this. I think when the author was writing them, their text got cut off, and they didn't realize it, and so there may be triggers here. I'm not entirely sure, and I apologize for that. But yeah, I do remember, even though I don't remember like what property or what intellectual property this is a fan fiction of, there was mention of this being like a character's backstory that the author invented for them. So let's just take a look at it. Saying goodbye. It was horrible weather to be leaving anyone out, let alone a baby. The wind was harsh and wet, despite there being no rain. Her pale purple hair flowed around her, thankfully not letting any wetness get on the baby. Lavender couldn't help but wonder if this was her warning to not give up something so precious. Again, this reminds me of a movie. It reminds me of Meet the Robinsons. And once again, that's not actually really relevant to what's going on in the work. So anyway, I digress. But yeah, we have a baby who is apparently being left out in the rain. And it sounds like they have magic hair that's keeping them dry, which is interesting. But anyway, let's keep going. The child was silent the whole walk to the nearest orphanage. Not even the wind seemed to bother him. For a cruel moment, Lavender wondered if she had killed the child by going out in such cold. But the child's fussing eased her mind. But that relief... Okay, one thing to point out. 2 consecutive sentences that start with but. Sounds a little redundant, especially when this first sentence is so short. But anyway. But the child's fussing eased her mind. But that relief didn't last longer. I think you just want long. But that relief didn't last long as she saw the orphanage just in the distance. Yeah. Each step sent a hollow thought in her mind. Each step was another choice closer to giving up. So once again, it sounds a little redundant to start the sentences the same way there. I will say that reads slightly more impactful than the repeated buts. Because it's sort of emphasizing, what happens with each step. And taking a step is a repetitive action in and of itself, so it makes sense to repeat that sentence after sentence. But having those repetitions in such quick succession with 2 other repetitions comes off as, again, redundant. But we'll keep going. Soon the door of the orphanage was up close. She stared at the wood for a while before thrusting her head to the side. She couldn't afford to keep this child, this physical manifestation of one drunken night between 2 friends. Caraway didn't want children. He never did. If he knew of this love child, then... Pretty good. Caraway. Isn't there a Nick Carraway? Who is that? Is that Great Gatsby? I can't remember. I'm bad with character names. Anyway. She took a sharp inhale as she set the basket down. He punched his tiny fists into the air as if he were trying to convince his mother not to leave him. Before she stood up, she reached down and planted a kiss on the child's head. She gazed down at him, frowning at the familiar features of her and her friend all contorted into one face. Sorry, one thing I'm beginning to realize is the purple hair was probably of Lavender, not of the baby. Anyway, sorry, moving on. This was for the sake of her friend, maybe even a little for her. She wished she could apologize, say sorry for having him in such an inconvenient way, instead of giving him the chance he deserved. The only ease on her mind was her convincing herself he'd be adopted quickly. He was still just a baby. People wanted babies more than children who could speak. Dang. I laugh only because, there kind of is some truth to that. It's harder for orphans the older they get, right? So, kind of blunt, but yeah, I mean, sad. It's effective because it's true, right? She lifted her hand to knock on the door, but couldn't find herself to even make a quiet knock. That reads a little bit awkwardly. I think it would read a little bit better as couldn't find it in herself to even make a quiet knock. What was holding her back? She knew why she was giving him up. She knew why it wouldn't be good to keep him. She knew what his future life would hold. She knew everything about the child. A name. He needed a name. She doubted that if she had neglected a name for so long... Wait, what? She doubted that if she... I think there's a typo in there. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that's meant to say. Oh, wait, that's not even the end of the sentence. Hang on. She doubted that if she had neglected a name for so long, the staff wouldn't think of a decent one to give. Okay, that becomes clear. But I think there is a way you could tighten up that sentence a little bit. But what could she write it on? She could write it on the wet window, but that wouldn't work. She looked around before a garbage heap caught her eye. Good enough. She tore off one of the box flaps and hoped that there would be a convenient marker or pen somewhere. Luckily, children were never listened to, and there was a whole bundle of small markers inside of the box. She made her way back to the boy, writing down the first name that came to mind. Rosemary. It was immediately crossed out. She would rather save that name for when she got a child she could keep. Besides, it was likely that he would grow up to resent such a girly name. Her mind ran again. Chicory, mint, dill, cilantro, mandrake. Before moving on, I think that's played for laughs. At least cilantro, I think, right? Chicory, mint, dill, I suppose those all work as names, right? But cilantro, that just is kind of funny to me. I assume that was meant to be a joke. But anyway, it looks like mandrake is the name the speaker or the subject lands on here. She found herself writing the last name without meaning. She looked down at it, her blind writing making the name wobbly. She hoped it would be thrown out the moment they registered his name. She set the cardboard in the basket, tiny hands immediately holding on to it. She took a breath as she knocked on the door, before running away out of sight. She could hear the child cry as the door opened. Now he was gone. She staggered, her body sliding down the wall. She felt the urge to cry, the urge to take back her baby. But she straightened herself. She pulled a hair tie from her pocket. She took her hair and did her best to tie it up. She ended up with a thick ponytail that hung just down her back. She didn't know if she would ever be able to wear it down again. Not after this guilt-ridden day. 13 years. Okay, so kind of sounds like that was sort of the end of like the prologue or the first chapter, and this is the beginning of the next chapter. 13 years. That's how long he has been stuck in this awful home. Abandoned by his parents with nothing but his name. Left in an orphanage that could care less about him if he was stabbed and left on the floor, bleeding. Really, the only time they would care would be if he decided to cry too loudly. The crack in the wall of his room was a good reminder to keep his tears silent. So one thing to note is that the mother, Lavender, right, who left Mandrake at the orphanage, was incorrect in thinking that, this baby would be adopted soon because he was a baby. So that's sad, right? To just jump 13 years and Mandrake is still in the orphanage. So sad but effective. 5 families. Sorry. That's how many families have tried to welcome him in his home, only to put him right back in the shithole they got him from in favor of someone else. He could still remember each reason they sent him back. He cries too much. He won't work. He doesn't feel like my son. He's too clingy. I don't like him. So one thing is, twice now it's been pointed out that this boy cries a lot. And isn't Mandrake the name of the plant from Harry Potter that cries a lot? I could be wrong about that. I'm not up to date on my Harry Potter lore. But regardless, noting that quirk of this character is important. This is a young boy, a 13-year-old boy apparently, who cries a lot, which kind of sounds atypical, right? The 13-year-old boys that I would picture, they would probably want to project masculinity, and toxic masculinity kind of dictates that men don't cry, right? And yet this boy cries a lot. So just kind of something interesting to note, and a good character trait, a good way to define this character through something that they do, right? Character is as character does, and this character cries a lot. So what more does that say about them? So interesting. Every time he finally felt loved, he was sent back with another bundle of disgusting words that told him why he was unlovable. 13 years and 5 families. No, he shook his head. 6 families. He always forgot the first. The first one to decide to get rid from the moment he was born. Again, I think it should say get rid of him from the moment he was born. But anyway. From what he was told, he was left in a basket on the doorstep with nothing but a piece of cardboard with his name written in sloppy handwriting, as if it was only thought of on the spot. He sat up, kind of some fun irony there. He sat up on his bed, the springs of the mattress creaking under his movement. He reached over and opened the door to his dresser before pulling out that same piece of cardboard. Returning to lay on his back, he held it up to look at it. The cardboard was floppy and easy to bend. There was a rip down the middle that was hastily taped back together with cheap, clear tape, even if it was years ago. He would never forgive the kid that decided to destroy every item in his room. So this, for real, this is some cool backstory that's being built here. It would maybe be interesting, to see these moments play out in a flashback. Because, yeah, that sounds like something very impactful to have this only object that the child really possesses, right? The only thing that they were left with. To have that destroyed, torn down the middle, that sounds traumatizing. And so it sounds like something we would want to see in great detail, right? If we're supposed to be following this character's journey. Maybe that's even something that hasn't happened yet and happens as we're reading with this protagonist. So just a thought to consider there. Despite the bruises, his name was still there, as clear as the sun on a cloudy day. Mandrake, he whispered, as if saying it would do him any good. He flipped it to the back, a blob scribbled out from what he assumed was going to be his original name. He had spent so long trying to figure out what it originally said. So far, he could only assume that the first half of the name was Rose. There were still a few more letters, but they were still too blobbed out to fully make out. He flipped it back to his name. So, similar to some notes I've already made, but to use the word still twice in the same sentence, again, just a little bit redundant, but moving on. He let out of the cardboard, and it fell onto his face. I think let go of the cardboard is what it's meant to say, covering his vision. He didn't want to see the chipped gray that covered every inch of his room. This flimsy piece of cardboard was the only taste he had of what his life could have been. Sometimes he liked to imagine what life with his original family would have been like. He always imagined a mom and a dad, a mom with his eyes and a dad with his hair. 2 people that would have loved him if they had just given him a chance. He felt his eyes beginning to sting, and he took the cardboard off before his stupid emotions could ruin it any more than it already was. Any more than it already had, I think is the correct verb agreement. He set it on top of his dresser, unable to get the strength to put it back in the drawer. No sooner when he set it down did the emotions spill out. His hand went to cover his eyes immediately, becoming wet from the familiar tears coating it. No noises came out thanks to the days of staying silent. All the while, words filled his head. Why didn't anyone love him? Okay, so there's a lot of effective stuff going on here. I think some things that would be more effective, really just kind of what I mentioned with the cardboard being torn in half. It would be effective if we saw that as the subject was seeing it, right? We're supposed to empathize with this character. Let us go on a journey with him. Let us stand next to him as he hears these comments from the families that rejected him, right? That would be a really great way to open this section that starts with 13 years, right? Have it open with him, Mandrake, listening to the words of this family who took him back, right? Maybe he's listening in private because, maybe the family has the decency not to say it in front of his face. But that would do a number on him, right? And it would do a number on us, the reader, as well. So, yeah, that's really my main piece of advice here. And to that point, with us being along for the ride, some dialogue would help to shake things up so that it's not just the narrator speaking the whole time. But like I said, there is a lot of really effective stuff going on here. And frankly, like I said, I don't know what IP this is attached to as a fan fiction. And the author noted that this is like an excerpt from a larger work. Frankly, this could be a story unto itself with a little bit more tweaking and fine-tuning. I would read more of this personally. But yeah, once again, the author goes by Coffee, and they do have a Wattpad, wattpad.com/user/Arizona Teen. So thank you for that submission. Moving on to the next one, we have, I think it's Prose by Asher Ambris. You can find their work at Asher More Like Trasher on Tumblr, which I think is a clever, funny username. So good on you, Asher. I say that I think this is Prose, but I don't know that for a fact. So I guess, I don't know, we're all going to find out what this is together. It's just one page, which is interesting. There is a content warning. Short descriptions of a character experiencing touch aversion from trauma, but nothing graphic or delving deep into what caused it. So keep that in mind. Okay, so also some notes on the characters being mentioned here. The author noted that this scene is part of a longer fantasy series. So it was previously mentioned that one character, Eiko, has lightning magic, and another character, Keelan, has fire magic. Okay, so I assume that context is going to be important for what we're reading here. A serene feeling overcame both men as they sat by the shore of the lake. The quiet yet ever-present sound of lightly lapping water nicely complementing the sweet breeze rustling the leaves. Okay, so quick note to start. That's a nice description. I can put myself into what's being described here. I will say, though, there are quite a few gerunds in that sentence. Lapping, complementing, rustling. Those three pretty close in succession. Maybe we could rewrite it as the quiet yet ever-present sound of lightly lapping water nicely complemented the sweet breeze rustling through the leaves. I think that makes it sound a little less like a list and a little more like a proper description of imagery, right? Maybe that's nitpicking, and it probably totally is. But just one thing to kind of keep the sentence a little more engaging and sound a little less repetitive, right? Eiko breathed in deeply. He'd never felt so truly relaxed before. Most, if not all, of his guard now let down, no work into holding up a readiness to fight if need be. He leaned his head against Keelan's shoulder, sighing, gloved hands threading together, then undone again, as they'd been doing the whole time. The only wall Eiko had truly left up. I assume that's talking about the gloves, or maybe the unclasping of the hands. I'm not sure. As much as he'd wanted to, Eiko was unable to ever let Keelan touch his hands. Okay, sorry, I should have just read on, and I would have answered my own question. Memories much too thick and painful, even with the gloves. Once again, I am reminded of an animated movie. This time it's Frozen with the gloves and the trauma and everything. Anyway, sorry. Moving on. Keelan looked down at Eiko, who had tensed up as he stared at his gloved hands with distaste. He chuckled slightly at that and put his arm around Eiko's shoulder, pulling him close as he rested his head against Eiko's. Eiko shifted to look Keelan in the eyes, and with both distracted, he ever so slowly peeled off one glove, then the other, carefully making sure that Keelan's attention was anywhere other than his hands. Eiko tentatively reached towards... Okay, I think you want to leave off the S there. Eiko tentatively reached toward Keelan's free hand resting over his lap, lightning jumping from his fingers to Keelan, causing attention to shift. Eiko tensed as Keelan's eyes widened at the sight of Eiko's ungloved hands. The thin and long fingers were twitching as they hovered over Keelan's, apostrophe. Skin pale from being hidden for so long. Long, winding pink scars traced almost the entirety of his hands. Keelan's hand reached up towards Eiko's, apostrophe, causing it to jerk backwards and for Eiko to look away, sparks of lightning accentuating the movements. Keelan looked up and back towards Eiko, semicolon. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask the obvious question, but Eiko quickly interjected when he felt the warm, caring eyes on him. Another thing to note when it comes to keeping the sentences from feeling less monotonous, some pronouns, right? We could use a little more pronouns and a little less proper nouns, because in this paragraph, we read the words Keelan and Eiko over and over again. And I know the author probably wants to distinguish them one from another because they're both male, right? And so using the he pronoun could potentially confuse the reader as to who's doing what. But there is a way to make it clear, right? And there are other ways besides pronouns and besides proper nouns to convey who is doing what, right? People have titles. People have characteristics that distinguish them. Obviously, we're just kind of jumping into the middle of this, and so we don't know all of those characteristics exactly. But assuming that this is part of a larger series, the reader would know by now the features of these characters or the titles that they may have. And so throw some of those in there to kind of spice up this paragraph a little bit, because it is, like I said, slightly monotonous to read the names over and over again like that. It's like that Schoolhouse Rock song, right? About pronouns, where the singer says, saying all those nouns over and over can really wear you down. He's not joking. So anyway, moving to the next paragraph. Don't. His voice shook, period, or don't capitalize his. Don't. His voice shook slightly as he looked back at Keelan. Please. Eiko was relieved when Keelan closed his mouth, a faint smile tracing his lips as he nodded slightly. His gaze shifted back to Eiko's ungloved hands, still hovering over Keelan's. A silent question for permission left Keelan's gaze. Eiko stayed staring at their hands, but nodded almost imperceptibly after a beat. Keelan's fingers ever so slowly moved towards Eiko's. Again, I think you don't want the S on the word toward. As if not to scare a wild animal, which he may as well be. You want that in the past tense, which he may as well have been. Their fingers intertwined. Eiko felt the rough, calloused hands of Keelan, and Keelan felt the surprisingly soft, almost fragile skin on Eiko's. So one thing that I haven't pointed out yet is just that this is completely believable, right? This person, as noted in the trigger warning, clearly has some trauma related to wounds on their hands. And I think that they're behaving very believably for somebody who has that backstory, right? And they're showing these wounds to their, I assume their partner. It sounds like there's romance between these two. They're showing these wounds to their partner for the first time. And once again, I just think that they're behaving in a believable way for somebody who's in this situation. So I feel like, personally, these characters are written realistically. And so I commend the author for that. Moving on. Eiko immediately felt a wave of revulsion as his mind and body screamed at him to move away from the touch, pulled from the present into the past and back again. Memories tied to hands that tugged at Eiko's attention. Lightning flowing through Eiko, all but thrashing within, trying to attack the supposed threat. But despite all the sickening memories of skin and viscera attached to his hands, Eiko stayed. Whether it was because he was paralyzed with fear or trying so hard to stop himself from running away from touch, didn't matter to him. All that mattered was that he and Keelan were both sitting on the shore of the slowly lapping lake, with a sweet breeze rustling the leaves and their hair, hands intertwined and without worry. Okay, so that's just cute, right? And I've said it before on this channel. When I say the word cute, I never mean for that to sound patronizing. Like, I mean that genuinely. I like when writing can be cute. I like when it can be upbeat. I like when it can be wholesome, right? And that's what this is. Despite the trauma, despite the hints at a darker past, there's a wholesome quality to this whole thing. And even though we know that this is part of a larger narrative, this could really work as like just a flash fiction story with just a few tweaks. I'm not sure if the author would be interested in doing that, but it just speaks to their ability to craft a scene with not very much at all, right? This doesn't rely on the audience knowing a lot to get all the points across here. So yeah, there's a lot of good going on here. Well done. Once again, this one comes from Asher, more like Trasher on Tumblr. And yeah, thanks for sharing this with us, Asher. I liked it. This last one is an essay that somebody wrote for their composition class. They wanted to remain anonymous, which I will absolutely honor. There was no content warning, but a note was left with the submission. Essentially, the person who wrote the essay said that the professor was very particular in the way that they graded, and the student, the author, felt that they had to dumb down the work to suit the professor's criteria. So this is a first draft of the work, and they had to revise it in a way that they didn't like to meet the professor's grading criteria. And so the author basically wants to know if this draft was good, right? So we're going to find that out. I believe the author also mentioned that this is an essay essentially persuading us to think that the show What We Do in the Shadows is a good show and one worth watching. I think that was the premise of the essay, but we're going to find that out as we begin. So this essay is called The Vampire's Next Door. The television show What We Do in the Shadows, based on the movie of the same name, masterfully employs the marks of great satire to make a thoroughly enjoyable experience for almost all audiences. Okay. So one thing that I'll say is I have not seen What We Do in the Shadows, neither the movie or the show, which is crazy. I know. I really, really want to watch both of them. But anyway, that may affect how I read this essay, but we'll see. One thing to note, though, is that sounds like a thesis, right? The television show What We Do in the Shadows, based on the movie of the same name, masterfully employs the marks of great satire to make a thoroughly enjoyable experience for almost all audiences. That sounds like the first half of a thesis, and I would presume the next sentence would be how and why it employs the marks of great satire. But let's find out. The show's creator, Jermaine Clement, and his co-executive producer, Taika Waititi, have an impressively extensive background in the entertainment industry. They've worked on shows such as Flight of the Conchords and The In-Betweeners, with Waititi even writing for the Thor franchise. These two have used their creative genius to birth a one-of-a-kind vampiric mockumentary series beloved by many. The colorful characters, absurd humor, dramatic undertones, and lighthearted critiques of What We Do in the Shadows all work together to create a cleverly crafted television show that playfully satirizes modern society and sitcoms. Okay, so that actually sounds like the thesis. It's in a list format, which sounds like each paragraph is going to tackle one aspect of the list. And so with that being the thesis, I would probably revise this first sentence to sound less argumentative. So rather than saying, the show, What We Do in the Shadows, employs the marks of great satire to make a thoroughly enjoyable experience for almost all audiences, either move that sentence down here before the list, or revise this sentence to make it sound less opinionated. Revise it to say, the television show What We Do in the Shadows has received this level of praise from critics, or you could even use a quote from a critic that praises the show, right? And that would be a good hook for a reader. I think all essays should start with a good hook, right? And then down here, of course, we have the actual argument. So that's one piece of advice just for essay writing in general. You don't want the essay to sound argumentative until you get to the thesis, which this is good thesis placement, by the way. We have the thesis, and from the thesis, I assume it's going to get straight into the argument. So looking at the thesis one more time, the colorful characters, absurd humor, dramatic undertones, and lighthearted critiques work together to create cleverly crafted television that playfully satirizes modern society and sitcoms. So I assume we're going to get one paragraph that talks about the characters, one that talks about the absurd humor, one that talks about the dramatic undertones, and one that talks about the lighthearted critiques. So let's see if I'm wrong or right. Without memorable subjects, even the most creative premise falls flat. True. But I don't think that should be the first sentence of this paragraph. I think the first sentence of this paragraph should be your topic sentence. It should be making a specific point about what we do in the shadows. You can still have this sentence in the paragraph, but it shouldn't be the first sentence. The main characters of What We Do in the Shadows are some of the most uniquely hilarious of any genre. Even their names warrant a chuckle. Okay, so this should be the first sentence of this paragraph. The main characters of What We Do in the Shadows are some of the most uniquely hilarious of any genre. End sentence. Next sentence, even their names warrant a chuckle. Laszlo Cravensworth and Nadia of Antipaxos are a married couple with a fiery yet loving dynamic. Nandor the Relentless, contrary to his name, is a goofy, sensitive, and sometimes buffoonish vampire. He has promised to change his human familiar, Guillermo, though it is painfully obvious that this will never happen. Finally, there is the basement-dwelling energy vampire Colin Robinson, who instead of draining the blood of his victims, drains their energy with annoying behavior that enrages them, or never-ending mundane small talk that puts them to sleep. Okay, so that sentence was a tiny bit lengthy. I might streamline that, divide up that sentence a little bit. But besides that, I think it works so far. The points are coming across very clearly. And I'm chuckling along to what's being said here, so I have a hard time disagreeing with these points. The exaggerated personalities of this group of friends, quotes, inevitably lead to outrageous, awkward, and sometimes unbelievable situations. That's a pretty good closing sentence in the sense that I assume it's going to lead into the next sentence where it's going to delve deeper into what these situations are. So, aside from well-developed characters, there are a few general traits that deem something humorous. Again, that shouldn't be the topic sentence. The topic sentence should relate back to the thesis and say something specifically about what we do in the shadows. This is just kind of a general statement regarding any piece of media, right? So again, it can be in the paragraph, but it shouldn't be the topic sentence. And to that point, ideally the last sentence of each paragraph should also tie back to the thesis. But anyway, let's keep going. Firstly, anything that goes against social norms has the potential to be funny. Watching someone act in a way that is considered embarrassing or improper usually induces some discomfort in a viewer, which in turn makes them laugh to alleviate the feeling. I agree with these points, but these should be the expounding based on evidence from the show. You're taking an outside and then looking in approach, whereas you should be looking in first and then looking out based on the specific evidence, right? This is analysis. Analysis comes after the evidence in an essay. So that would be one thing to workshop. And this is just if I were the teacher here, right? This is essentially me as if I were like an AP language or an AP literature professor or teacher, excuse me, saying what the AP board would be looking for from your essay, essentially. What we do in the shadows is abundant with uncomfortable exchanges and tone-deaf actions. So yeah, just an organizational note. That should come before this analysis. In the pilot episode, for example, while checking out a store, Nandor attempts to pay by hurling out-of-date currency at the cashier. The worker responds by saying, "You can't be throwing ancient coins at me." Although the man calls attention to Nandor's lack of understanding of basic modern tasks, the vampire doesn't acknowledge his unacceptable behavior and deems the cashier inferior to him. In another episode, the vampire's human neighbor invites them to a Super Bowl party, which they attend wearing 15th century clothing. After their neighbor mentions in passing that... After their neighbor mentions in passing that he only sees them at night and jokingly calls them vampires, they panic and hypnotize him so severely that his brain is fried. Unable to reverse the damage, they decide their only option is to murder him. They attempt to make his last night a great experience by showing him all their vampire powers, such as flying and transmutation. Despite the neighbor screaming and asking them to stop, the vampires remain oblivious to his distress and continue terrifying him, believing he is enjoying himself. I assume that's the name of the episode. Anyway. So yeah, again, and this is going to differ depending on, your teacher and your professor, but notes that I would make on this as a draft are just tying everything back to the thesis, right? The topic sentence of each paragraph should directly be an extension of your thesis, and then ideally the closing sentence of each paragraph should also tie back to the thesis. You present your argument, you present the evidence, you conduct analysis, and then you tie it back to the argument, right? That's basically how any paragraph in an essay should operate, in an English language essay, in theory, right? Again, it's going to depend on your professor, but anyway. Along with rule breaking and bad etiquette, people or objects being out of place in their setting tend to be amusing. So these topic sentences so far sound more like sentences in an essay that's trying to argue what makes something humorous, right? And if that were the case, if that were the thesis, and it were using what we do in the shadows simply as evidence to support that thesis, that would be fine. But the thesis, the essay, according to the thesis, is about why what we do in the shadows is great, right? And so the process, I think, should be reversed. I think we have it a little bit backwards here. And again, if we were to make the thesis backwards from how it is already, then this would be good. The organization here would be spot on, right? I think we're just kind of missing the wood for the trees based on the way that we've organized our argument and the thesis. But anyway, moving on with this paragraph. The initial confusion that's felt when seeing something where it shouldn't or couldn't be gives way to laughter once the brain processes the preposterousness of the scene. The characters in what we do in the shadows are, by default, out of place, and it only gets more absurd from there. In the episode Ancestry, the vampires attend a funeral at a church. The last place one expects to find a demonic creature. They last all of 10 seconds before their eyes begin bleeding and their arms catch fire. In another instance, they are brought before the vampiric council to stand trial. Instead of the sophisticated, ominous, all-powerful organization that the name suggests, this council's behavior more closely resembles an awkward group of office workers with an ill-prepared presentation. While introducing themselves, they discover some missing members and whisper amongst themselves, trying to figure out who couldn't come and why. They even have the actor Wesley Snipes attending via Zoom, with his slow Wi-Fi causing him to lag the entire trial. So many details in these situations are out of place, making it nearly impossible not to guffaw at the lunacy of it all. Okay, so that's a pretty decent closing sentence for this paragraph, because it references the show specifically, and also ties back to the thesis. And if the thesis were, this backwards thing that I suggested, it would still tie back to the thesis, right? Because it's mentioning the show and what makes the show funny specifically. Oh my gosh, sorry, did I not follow? Sorry, guys. I'll try to keep up a little bit better. I'm just getting a little bit lost in the writing here. Despite my gripes with, the organization of this essay, it actually is well written. The points are coming across clearly. Surprisingly, another element of great comedy is the ability to work as a drama. Yes. Yeah, same thing that I've said this whole time, same point. Esteemed comedy writer, director, and producer Judd Apatow advises writers of comedy to approach their work as if they were writing a dramatic screenplay. Otherwise, he asserts, the stories don't really have a reason to exist. There should be an in-text citation for that quote, but moving on. Some could argue that What We Do in the Shadows falls into that category, as the premise is so absolutely ludicrous that it couldn't possibly translate into a serious form of art. On the contrary, if stripped of its jokes, the show would be quite dark. The centuries-old vampires living in the 21st century struggle to navigate modern circumstances and relationships, even straining to understand something as simple as email. Guillermo is, for all intents and purposes, a willing slave to Nandor because he believes his hard work will earn him the reward of eternal life, something he has wanted since childhood. Yet it is evident that Nandor never intends to bestow this gift upon his familiar. In the case of Colin Robinson, his pestiferous and tiresome nature prevents him from forming any long-term, meaningful relationships, leaving him isolated to his cold, drab basement bedroom. Satire connoisseurs might okay, there was a paragraph break there, but it didn't really feel like there should have been, because again, this doesn't feel like a concluding sentence, right? And so it's like, are we on to a new topic, or are we still talking about drama? I'm not sure, because the organization is a little bit off. But regardless, satire connoisseurs might dismiss What We Do in the Shadows based on the nature of its critiques. Compared to other recent... Okay, so, interesting topic sentence. It sounds like the author is about to address a counter-argument, and that's made clear by this topic sentence, which is addressing the thesis directly by addressing the show directly and one of its moving parts, right? So anyway, this is a good topic sentence. Compared to other recent series of the same genre, such as BoJack Horseman and Atlanta, the targets of this show's criticism aren't serious matters. The argument could be made that satire exists in order to draw attention to critical flaws of modern culture, such as addiction or racism. Though this belief has good intentions, it is quite a cynical way of thinking. The way What We Do in the Shadows highlights what are usually unremarkable aspects of people's lives today, by depicting someone from a bygone era trying to participate in them, allows the viewer to reflect on the wildly unnatural world that humans have built for themselves. Okay, again, that's a pretty lengthy sentence, and I got a little bit lost following some of the pronouns there. I might split that into two sentences. Yeah. When the vampires are asked to sign for a package with their fingers on a tablet, they can't grasp the concept. Laszlo refuses to even attempt it without a quill and ink. In the example from the pilot episode, Nandor doesn't understand that making a purchase doesn't require physical currency. Making light of simple parts of everyday life in this way serves as a reminder to not take life too seriously. Okay, I like that. But again, one more sentence tying that back directly to the thesis would be nice. Similarly, satirizing sitcoms can accomplish the same goal by emphasizing silly and campy features of standard works in the genre. It's easy to develop a sort of emotional investment in the lives of regular sitcom characters, as their personalities and predicaments are written to be relatable, reminding viewers of the people and situations in their own lives. But with characters who act in manners surely unfamiliar to regular people while facing nonsensical, I think that's just one word, no hyphen required, unless the author's trying to really emphasize the word, in which case I like it. Unrealistic issues, there is hardly anything to parallel real life. This stark separation of show from reality prevents those watching from getting wrapped up in the lives of fictional people, almost opposite to the goal of traditional sitcoms. Because of this, audiences can maintain a more grounded perspective while watching, making it easier to appreciate one's own reality. While, of course, there is nothing wrong with getting lost in a made-up world when watching a show or film, it's refreshing to have an alternative, less intense way to enjoy consuming media. I agree. Yeah. Okay, final paragraph. Ultimately, What We Do in the Shadows is fantastic in the way it uses its characters and their outlandish interactions to point out often overlooked aspects of the human experience while still maintaining an underlying sense of dramatic purpose. Okay, so it sounds like that's a restatement of the thesis, which is always a good way to conclude the essay. Some teachers are going to disagree on what to do from there. Restating the thesis is a good opener for the conclusion, but at that point, do you restate all the points you made? Maybe. Some teachers will tell you to do that. Other teachers will tell you to take your thesis and then expound on it and essentially say, like, what was the point of this essay? Where do you take these thoughts from here? Where does a reader go with all this information now? So what you do depends on your professor. I am more in favor of the latter because I think basically restating your points is just kind of tiresome. like if you did a good job with your essay, you shouldn't need to restate your points. Like, because I was reading, I was following, I should know exactly what you were trying to say. You shouldn't have to say it again. So it would be more interesting for me as a reader to have something else to think about, something that the author can expound upon. So we'll see where this essay finishes up, and I'll attribute it to whatever the professor wanted. But anyway, from devious plots gone awry to hysterical misunderstandings stemming from centuries-wide age gaps, the world of these vampires is wonderfully written and full of mishaps to enjoy. With the brilliant use of widely accepted standards of comedy, Clement and Waititi have successfully created a show that is both hilarious and valuable to watch. If the goal of satire is to challenge accepted norms while simultaneously inducing laughter, What We Do in the Shadows is certainly one of the best satires of its time. Okay, yeah, so it sounds like sort of, a restatement of all the arguments that have been made so far, which is fine. That's probably what the professor wanted. And it works as a conclusion because it does conclude the essay based on everything we've read up to this point. So, yeah. It is well written, genuinely. The points came across clearly. I just think it has some of its structure a little bit backwards. And I think I already beat that point into the ground, so I won't, harp on it too much longer. I think the essay just kind of got confused as to whether it was arguing for what makes good comedy or what makes What We Do in the Shadows such a good show. So that was my only real issue with it, is the thesis didn't quite match the structure of the essay itself and the order of analysis that was being performed. But like I said, it is very well written, and if the author were to just move some things around, then it would be just perfect, basically. But I can tell this author, this writer, really does have skill in writing. They seem very experienced, frankly. They also had a page of citations. I just cut it off for the sake of my printer, trying to conserve ink as best I can. But this was a good read, and I want to thank this anonymous author for submitting this. Excuse me. It was cool to get an essay rather than a piece of fiction. But I want to thank all the authors who submitted work this time around, and genuinely thank you guys for watching and for sending stuff in. That's a very brave thing to do. I'll always emphasize that. And if you're still watching up to this point, thank you for watching, and we'll go ahead and end it there. So, see you guys in the next one.